Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Door to Door. I'm Virginia Stanley, joined by my trusty colleagues here. Who are you guys? Want to say hi?
Hey, Chris Connolly here. Really excited about today. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Lady Mays.
Well, we have a really cool episode today. A wonderful program with two very special authors who have written two nonfiction books about women pioneers, women who were doing things um, that took extraordinary courage and guts. And we are so happy to have with us Kim Todd, author of Sensational, The Hidden History of America's Girl Stunt Reporters, and Jennifer Armstrong, who's written the book When Women Invented Television, the untold story of the female powerhouses who pioneered the way we watch today. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're so excited to talk to both of you because you've really touched a nerve with so many people in house at Harper. These books are just they've been very well received. People are so excited about these books because it's so exciting to learn about women who, as you say, you know, decades and decades ago. We're going to start with Kim first to talk about her book, which is taking place in the late 1800s, and then we're going to come through and then talk to Jennifer about to the early 1900s and mid 1900s and how women were affecting television. So, but these are brave women. This is March is Women's History Month, and so we wanted to get the word out early about these books and have you read them and learn about these women. Many of you probably know about them, but uh, it's been a journey, boy, to go down the rabbit hole of these two books to learn so much about the bravery of these women is really pretty empowering and enlightening. So, Kim, Jennifer, thank you again. We're really looking forward to our discussions with you. So we're going to start first with Kim to talk about her book Sensational. So Jennifer, you're going to go into the virtual green room, hang out, watch this, and then come back. And then at the very end, the five of us will come back and we can do a little wrap up about all things women, strength and power and bravery. So cool. All right, Jennifer, we'll see you in a little bit. Kim, come into the fold. Your square just got bigger.
Okay.
So, how are you?
I'm great. I'm excited to talk about this book and share with you my obsessive thoughts for the past 3 years. So,
Well, good. Let's get going on this. So, Chris, we're going to start with the jacket here. And so, what we want to do is have you tell us what you want us to know about this book. I'm very curious what made you write the book. Chris Laney and I will all have questions for you, a couple of interior illustrations that you'll speak to. But maybe right now you could just sort of give us a little background on the book, what it's about, and why did you write it?
yeah. So it grew out of really two separate strands of interest that came together. The first was that a number of years ago, I read 10 Days in the Madhouse by Nellie Bly, which is her account of going undercover in Blackwell's insane asylum for women and spending 10 days there and then writing a report for Pulitzer's World, which really exposed the horrible treatment of the women there. And it struck me when I was reading it that it was completely readable and enjoyable more than 100 years later. Like it was based in scenes, it had these amazing characters, it had this like empathetic and funny narrator. And I was like, oh, this is like what we think of as creative nonfiction today. And it didn't feel dated at all. So I was really interested in her and that kind of storytelling, which she was doing. And then, Lainey, do you want to show the picture of Nellie Bly? So there's Nellie Bly. This isn't when she goes into the asylum, but this is several years later when she goes around the world in record time. And so part of me was interested in Nellie Bly and her work. And then I also knew this story in 1888, which was a year after Nellie Bly's first story, when this woman just named the Girl Reporter went undercover in Chicago for the Chicago Times, and she went to all these doctors and asked if they would give her an abortion. And abortion was illegal at the time, and it was like a month-long series that she did, and this really fascinating expose. And then even more fascinating was it was very informative, to sort of the dismay of some people. It was very scandalous, and then she disappeared. So one afternoon, I found myself with free time in Chicago, and I went to the Harold Washington Library, and I was like, I wonder if I read the whole series, if I could figure out who she was, if she left any clues about, you know, who she might have been. So that started me on the track of the Girl Reporter. And then, and Lainey, do you want to show the Girl Reporter picture? Because the Chicago Times really played this up, and they ran this picture. They were like, guess who is the Girl Reporter? You know, it's sort of moderately effective because they all look the same to me. But yeah, they really made a lot of the mystery of this woman. So I put the two together, and I realized that like Nellie Bly's series was so wonderful, so effective, so well read, that it created like a decade of opportunity for women doing this kind of undercover work, particularly exposing issues of interest to women. And so I wrote about a bunch of them. Lainey, do you want to show Nora Marks? So papers throughout the country hired girl stunt reporters and sort of promoted them. You know, here you can say, you know, like, what's Nora Marks' latest adventure? And so I wrote about these stunt reporters, and then I also wrote about some other really innovative investigative journalists like Ida B. Wells and Victoria Earl Matthews, who weren't doing stunts per se, but were really pushing the edges of journalism in these amazing ways. And then lastly, I'll just show the last two pictures because the form evolved. And so at its height in like 1896, when so many papers had reporters doing these stunts, Joseph Pulitzer's The World almost every week ran women doing stunts with these big illustrations. So here you have Dorothy Dare's Wild Ride on the Snowplow. And then if you want to show Kate Swan, the next one. You have Kate Swan driving an electric engine. And these sort of seem tame now, but you realize that like women at the time were completely constrained in terms of like what their bodies were supposed to be able to do, what kind of jobs they were supposed to be able to hold. There was still this really strong strain of thinking of like, well, they belong in the house and not out in public life. And here you have these illustrations of these women doing like very adventurous, physically taxing things. And they kind of helped create not just like nonfiction, not just investigative journalism as we think about it, but also just the character of the brave, intrepid girl reporter, which we still see with, you know, comic book heroines like Lois Lane and Brenda Starr. And it really became a fixture in our cultural vocabulary. So those are my thoughts of the past 3 years. That's what I've been obsessing about.
And one thing I really found, oh, sorry, go ahead, Virginia, did you have it? Okay,
No,
I just wanted to add.
We're all jumping down your throat. All right, Chris, you go. All I wanted to say was we were talking before about how incredibly brave they were to go off and do these things, and no one really, like we were saying, like today you'd have a cell phone and you'd say, if I'm not back by whatever time, find me. And like, I can't even imagine, you know, when the book opens and this woman is going around to telling all these doctors that she's pregnant, and she's trying, I mean, it's just to figure out, you know, what the response is going to be and compile all this information. But anything could have happened to any one of them at any time. It's just incredibly brave. That's all I want to say. No cell phones. Okay, 1800s, but it's amazing.
Yeah, Kim, I just wanted to ask a little bit more. I mean, again, we start with Nellie Bly in the book, and you mentioned her language and how she wrote. And this is at the time when newspapers were changing, and you provide great historical context about what kind of reader the newspapers and Pulitzer were going after, and it was immigrants and working class people, and how you gave an example of like what a newspaper intro sounded like before Nellie Bly. Could you talk a little bit about the shaping, because she really did shape the landscape for readership at large in the
Yeah,
United States?
yeah, I mean, she used this like very simple, direct language and not a huge vocabulary. Unlike, it's interesting, like a lot of the male reporters at these papers had gone to college, and specifically a huge number of them had gone to Harvard. And the female reporters, like a lot of times had like no education past high school. And so, were making their way just by being well read. And practicing writing and what they learned in the newsroom. I actually have a little, the section that I was going to read just sort of talks about Nellie Bly's style. So I'll just jump in and read that now. So she writes in the first person, and she really creates this engaging first person narrator that's really attractive. This strong first person point of view immersed readers in the narrator's experience. Bly's tone was confiding, a whisper to a trusted friend rather than the assertions of a disembodied observer, and the body she inhabited was specifically young and female. The reader was right next to her, shivering, thrown into the icy bath, smelling spoiled meat, responding to a handsome doctor, hiding behind a veil. This vivid narrator, full of life, moral but not preachy, was clearly enjoying herself. And if this little scrap of a person, this mere girl, as the Hazel Green Herald put it, could take on the whole system of institutions with wit and compassion and negligible acting ability, what couldn't be done? A stunt reporter had real power. Suddenly, everybody wanted to hire one or be one. And that kind of leads into the section of like all of these women all saying like, I want a job, and that's the job that I want.
It's really an opening into all of these women wanting to get out and do other things, and you never know how much it could have been put on the back burner if she hadn't stood up and did that. A lot of things that were terrifying. We were talking earlier about Nellie Bly going to the insane asylum and doing all of that stuff, and I'm like, to me, in this day and age, I'm like, oh gosh, what is she going to encounter and how's she going to get out of there? Like, I wouldn't even know. I would be scared to go even today. So lots of strong women who took that first step for a lot of people. And so what was your research process like, and did you find any fun things maybe somewhere you didn't expect to find them, or was it pretty much just reading a lot of newspaper articles?
It was reading a lot of newspaper articles, and then I also visited a whole bunch of different archives. So I went to like the Cook County archives to try to track down some lawsuits that the Chicago Times Girl Reporter was involved in. And I went and read letters by Elizabeth Jordan, who's one of the reporters who I talked to. I mean, not that I talked to, but that I read about. And so I looked at a lot of photographs of different people. I read Hearst's letter. One of the interesting things about the Girl Scout reporters is that like they were making opportunity for themselves, but they were also being used by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer as they were having their huge newspaper circulation battle in the 1890s. And so I looked at, how they were talking about the women reporters that they were hiring. I don't know. I mean, I found out a lot of really interesting things. I think always the most interesting to me was when a reporter was reflecting on what she was doing, because that made me really curious. A lot of times they put up, there was like sort of the veil of that first person I character, but then if you could get behind it in like one of their memoirs or in one of their letters and see like what they really thought about what they were doing, and if they had the power, or if the editors making these assignments had the power, that always was really fascinating for me.
Probably did feel like you were talking with them at times. I'd imagine you mentioned 3 years essentially working on this, right?
Yeah, well, I hope it feels that way. A lot of times I really wish that I could, like, what did you really think about that? But yeah.
Yeah. And that I think you mentioned perspective, and I found that really fascinating as far as giving voice to what it is to be in a female body, which up until that point was completely really unheard of. But also what was interesting is kind of the tight rope that they had to walk as far as propriety, and they had to be kind of still the kind of the virgin image of a woman. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how they navigated that?
Yeah, it was really interesting because, there was this whole idea of female chastity, for many, many years, which had been hugely prioritized. And like, if you were a chaste woman, then that made you worthy of protection. It made you worthy of being taken seriously. It made you worthy of sort of, it was like honor for men, right? Like people could take you at your word. And as soon as you lost that sense of chastity or the perception of chastity, well, then like men didn't have to defend you. They could treat you terribly. Nobody would believe what you had to say. So that was really, like you said, a tightrope that these women were walking, because on the one hand, they were exposing the situations of a lot of working class women by going into these factories. On the other hand, they really had to stay on the right side of the line to be taken seriously by readers. But a lot of people thought that they were not staying on the right side of the line. A lot of people thought that those pictures of Kate Swan and Dorothy Dare were like scandalous, and there were all kinds of books about professions for women at the time that were like, do not be a stunt reporter. Like that is not the path to being a respected writer. So there was definitely a lot of debate about, are these writers worthy of being taken seriously, or are they in some other category which is beyond decency?
Yeah,
I love
and I
that little
think
section. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Lainey.
I was just going to piggyback on that and say, like, especially in that first chapter, you talk a lot about the difference between men being seen as investigative reporters and this kind of being a lesser than. And so you explore that a lot in the book. But I just wondered if you could talk about the duplicity in that role and what people's reactions were.
Yeah, that was something that was also really interesting to me when I was looking into Nellie Bly. Like she's somebody who's famous and admired, but she's the sort of the really respected journalism category at the time was muckraker, and like Theodore Roosevelt uses it as a slur, and he's like, you don't want to be muckraker, but now it's a badge of honor, right? Like people are modern day muckrakers, and that's really thought of as like this early progressive era quality journalism. But the stunt reporters were doing it all a decade before, and I don't think that anybody like today wants to be like a girl stunt reporter. Like that's not a badge of honor. So I got very interested in the gendered nature of what we consider good, what we consider worthy of emulating, what we consider to be good writing. Um, I mean, it's interesting because even at the time, some women authors did not like this category of writing and felt like it was really sort of besmirching their possibilities for being taken seriously as journalists. So I felt a little bit like I was saying, like, people at the time didn't think it was good. Some people now don't think it's good, but what if it was good? What if we look at it through the lens of like, there was a real value here, um, that a lot of people saw, because these writers were hugely popular and very well paid as a result, which was one of actually the surprising things that I found out. You asked about what was surprising. One, it was just how many there were, hundreds all over the country. And two, yeah, they made a ton of money. It was a really good way to make a living. So
That part about William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer is pretty cool. That had to be pretty interesting to be diving into those that research.
oh yeah, it really was. And it's interesting because I think like a lot of people know that story. So it's always interesting to look at like, well, here's the story underneath that
Yeah,
story
yeah.
that people don't really know or don't really talk about, that these stunt reporters played a huge role in these circulation battles. Again, because they were so popular. And, you know, particularly Hearst was like, whatever works, you know, if a woman is going to get me a lot of readers, I don't care if it's decent or not, like I'm gonna hire a lot of women. And he did.
I don't know how I feel about that.
Yeah, I know. He's definitely an interesting character.
Well, he needed to sell, right? He needed
Yeah.
to keep, you know. We have a bunch of really great reviews of your book, and some I'd like to read, but we have a couple of questions too, so we want to make sure that we get to those as well.
Do you want me to ask one now, or do you want to do a quote first?
Do a what?
Do you want me
I'll
to
ask
ask one now?
I'll
or-
ask the question. I'll ask Vicky Nesting's question, and then we can go from there. How's that? So Vicky Nesting writes, our library pal, says, so nowadays the reporter would like to, let me see. So nowadays the reporter would likely be dismissed and discredited by the organizations they were investigating. For example, it's just this one woman, she's making it up, that sort of thing. You know, Eleni, can you read it, because my comment box keeps jumping and I can't see it all.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't remember where you got to, but she said
Oh,
organizations are investigating and they might have made it up. They're discrediting the women. It says it's just this one woman, etc. Did this happen back then too?
I mean, it definitely did, but the papers were actually really good about defending them. So the Chicago Times, there's these really interesting records of the Chicago Medical Society where they're talking about the reports of the girl reporter, and they are like mad and they want to discredit her, and they're saying this is ridiculous. And the paper defends her very publicly, as is the case with a lot of these other papers. One of the interesting things about those medical, the meetings of the doctors, is that they don't actually say that it didn't happen. They never say like, nobody came to my office and said this. They kind of acknowledge like, okay, that was the discussion, but she misinterpreted what we said. So that actually gives a huge amount of credibility to her reporting, that they didn't bother to say, you know, just straight out, she's lying. That's not what happened.
That's very interesting.
I find that very, interesting. Like I'm surprised by that. And that probably says a lot to my pessimistic state of getting behind women, but I'm surprised that they did that, and that's wonderful.
there's a great section in the book, Kim, that you provided. I think it's like a job posting for just to like, you know, provide context for the opportunities that were available before and after you kind of, you know, these trailblazing women, but the job postings for men and then the job postings for women, and just this little clip from a newspaper, and there's maybe two for women. It's, you know, cleaning or whatever, and then, you know, this whole long list, and it really just kind of hits home, you know, how much things opened up due to these women to start with. Could you talk a little bit? I'm just curious because, you know, you have the Pinkertons coming about, which are kind of like the opposite, you know, they're almost like the, I don't want to say evil opposite equivalent, but could you talk about kind of the circumstances surrounding these women, particularly like the labor movement and what was happening there?
Yeah. I mean, it is really interesting because a lot of things were not yet distinct at the time, when like 10 or 15 years or 20 years later, they would be very distinct. So like these women were talked about as being kind of detectives. These women were talked about as like, they were like just before factory inspectors. So in a way they were sort of doing like factory inspection on behalf of the newspapers. So the interesting thing about Pinkertons was like, so those were private detectives, and those were detectives that would be hired by the businesses to say like root out people talking about unions and that kind of thing. And the stunt reporters were sort of detectives for the people, right? And they were going in and reporting undercover on the conditions of the women working in the factories and how many long hours they worked, and that there wasn't any clean bathrooms, and very, very young people doing child labor. So the same notion of sort of spying, but from the opposite side.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting kind of dichotomy there. Let's see. Lillian Dabney says this book sounds amazing. Definitely a necessary story. Fascinating. People tuning in from all over.
Yeah. I'd like to read this one quote by Brooke Kroger, author of Nellie Bly, daredevil reporter and feminist. She says, "In Todd's able hands, we learn about these daring young women, about their lives and times, their work, their editors and mentors, their torments and loves, their interconnections, and best of all, their real legacy. These young reporters demonstrated the power of personal narrative to rivet public attention on society's seen and unseen ills and incite the quest for remedy, a tradition that endures today." I love that, because I love how it talks about the legacy. And we were speaking before about how, you know, you and Jennifer have written these books that are shining a light on women that that deserve it, that, you know, really did put so much of their, you know, their heart and soul on the line here. And at a time when, I mean, you know, it's absolutely staggering to think of the obstacles that were in their way, and yet they did that. And so, you know, I just think, you know, we all think that that this book, not only is it important and informative, but it reads like a novel. We were talking about that the other day, you know, and that's super fun. You know, I think we had said to you, or I said to you, it doesn't feel like a history assignment. That's not it.
Thank goodness.
At all. It's, I mean, I know you put 3 years of your life into this, and the result is that you've brought their lives to the forefront and to our, you know, to our consciousness. And I just think that what lovelier tribute can you give to someone, you know, and to just to shine a light on these really brave, strong, smart, fearless women. It's just fantastic. There are pages of quotes here. This, I mean, you can't swing a cat. And that's, I like to say, you can't swing a cat. And I find a great quote about this book. Sensational. Kim, you know, we could go on and on about this, but you know, I failed to mention that you're the author of 3 other books, which have won a number of prizes, including a Penn Gerard Award. We're at 2:30, and do we have anything else before I go? Got
One
another
more
question?
question if
Yeah,
we
yeah,
can.
Yeah.
So if we can fit one more question. Okay. So Jennifer Winberry said, were these women able to get into places and write their stories more easily because men might not have suspected how smart and astute they were?
Yes, definitely. And I think it was always so much of a pleasure for the writer and a pleasure for the reader when they would announce that they had been an undercover reporter, not just a naive young woman being taken advantage of. There's this one great moment where Nell Nelson, who did all this factory reporting for the Chicago Times, is like sexually harassed on the streetcar, and this guy like won't leave her alone, and he's following her and saying like, "Where are you going? What's your name?" You know, and she finally turns around and hands him a card that says like, "Nell Nelson, reporter, Chicago Times." And he's like, "Oh, sorry, gotta go." And I just think everybody, readers now, readers then, like could just sympathize with the pleasure in having been underestimated and actually having some power.
That's good. That's a great question. Leave it to a smart woman, a librarian. What's our next question here? We have another question. We must ask it. Christopher?
Yes, don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to, Kim. Amy White asks, could this be for teens too, or are the topics too heavy?
I mean, I hope it'll be for teens. It does really talk frankly about abortion. So how they feel about that, how the librarians feel about, how the parents feel about that. But I mean, a lot of these women were teens when they were doing the writing. So yeah, I hope it would be accessible and interesting for them.
Thank you. Thank you so much for feeling that. Let's see, just yeah, excitement and love for this book and the women in it. I think we covered all the questions and the comments. So again, you'll be joining us at the end. Virginia, did you want to say something before?
No, I just wanted to remind people that Kim is going to come back at the end after we speak with Jennifer, but also that librarians should reach out to us and or Kim if they would like to have her come to their library, because this is just a fascinating subject, and I think has just this wide appeal. I mean, yes, with teens, of course, that's subjective, but I just think it's fascinating and important. And so hopefully you all will, drop us a line and let us know how we can get in touch with you and put Kim in touch with you. That would be wonderful. So Kim, thank you. Your book, Sensational, is just that, sensational. Thank you for telling us about the Girl Stunt Reporters, and they have a lasting legacy now in your book. So congratulations to you.
My pleasure.
So, Kim, we'll see you in a little bit. You're going to hang out and eat virtual caviar. Step it up from M&M's.
We
Okay,
restocked.
we restocked. Okay, all right. Thanks, Kim. We'll be back. We'll talk to you in a little bit.
Okay.
How cool is that? Girl Stunt
cool.
Reporter. It's also would make a really cool T-shirt. That jacket, don't you think?
Mhm.
They're like, yeah, sure, whatever.
No, I'd wear it.
Wouldn't you? I would. Chris, you
Would.
would wear it.
Yeah.
Huh? Really neat.
Yeah.
Really neat. Man alive. People are brave. Love it. All right. Where is Miss Jennifer Armstrong? I see her. Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
Good, thanks.
Good. Were you able to watch Kim?
I was.
Oh, good. Well, part 2 now of us. I'm just calling this Women Pioneers. Oh, Pioneer. Because this is this is just a wonderful celebration of really cool, smart, brave, strong, fearless, or maybe they were afraid and they did it anyway, which is even cooler, women. So, Jennifer, your book, When Women Invented Television, which is on sale in March, is the story of female powerhouses who pioneered the way we watch TV today. Before we start, because I didn't do this before, just a quick recap of your accomplishments thus far, which are many. New York Times bestselling author of Seinfeldia, How a Show About Nothing Changed Everything. Also, Mary and Lou and Rhoda and Ted. Love and Sex in the City and Us, How 4 Single Women Changed the Way We Think, Live, and Love. You have wrapped yourself around television. Your beginning of your book gives a little background to you, which I love. I feel like we're not that far apart in age, a little far, but just completely getting, your interest in television and how it shaped us, which is, it's all true. It's all accurate. But what's so neat, what is so cool is the backstory, the backdrop. So we learned about these really cool, intrepid journalists. And now we're going to hear about these incredible women who were at the forefront when no one was really looking at that very big, expensive box with glass in it. Right?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I would love to just read the first couple paragraphs of the book to kind of get us into it. And then I can talk a little bit about, as you mentioned, my introduction after this kind of gets into how I actually found out about these women and looked into their legacies and histories. But first, I'm going to read a little bit from the very beginning. In the fall of 1948, a 49-year-old woman, the absolute prototype of a Jewish mother, marched into the Madison Avenue office of the famous and debonair William S. Paley, the man in charge of CBS, and she made a brazen demand. She wanted to write, produce, and star in her own television show. Gertrude Berg believed that she, of all people, deserved a spot on television, and she insisted that one of the most powerful men in media give it to her. This ultimatum alone would speak to her chutzpah in any TV era, including now, I would say. But she issued it in 1948, not a time when which we associate with women's liberation. 5'5" and 150 pounds, the mother of 2 grown children, Berg proposed an idea that seems radical even today, that she should star in a TV sitcom as the mother of 2 young teenagers. Of course, she did come with a track record. For the previous 2 decades during radio's golden age, she'd written and starred in a radio comedy called The Goldbergs. Radio had been the default dominant mode of national entertainment at the time. Families had gathered around their living room radios daily to hear the latest installments of their favorite dramas and comedies, as well as news and music. She had reigned supreme in this era. She looked like the prototype of a Jewish mother because she had created it. In fact, she had lived an entire situation comedy lifetime already. On her show, The Goldbergs, she had played radio's favorite meddling mother who had raised her children to adulthood over its 17-year course. Now she insisted on starting all over again as television's favorite mother. And she wasn't the only woman who made such bold claims on the new frontier of television, a discovery I was surprised to stumble upon in the early annals of the medium's history. So Gertrude is a force, as I just mentioned, kind of just marched right in and demanded that she get her own show, and eventually did, of course, succeed, or else we wouldn't be talking about her right now and writing books about her. But she is one of 4 women that I decided to focus on from this era. It's actually an era that was full of women. The joke I always make, and will probably make many times to come, is that if you see a bunch of women doing something, it's either because the men have not gotten there yet, or they've already left. In this case, they had not gotten there yet. Radio was still booming. That's where all the money was. So that's where the men were going to stay. Of course, this is where they had the power. It was great. But women started to kind of, and I would actually even mention a significant number of people of color, kind of started to see like, oh, I might be able to get in there. And if this thing takes off, I'll already be there, you know? And Gertrude was one of the early ones. This was 1948 that we were talking about. So Gertrude, there she is, always in the kitchen on her show. And I really like to mention this because an amazing thing about her character that kind of comes through in the book is the fact that Gertrude, the woman, she plays a woman named Molly Goldberg on TV. Gertrude Berg, the woman, would dress incredibly elegantly in furs and hats and gloves, and she did not know how to cook. She was not ever in the kitchen in her real life. She had a cook who did all of that for her. So her grandchildren told me like, oh no, that woman was not trying to cook. But in the show, she's constantly like doing really basic stuff. That was a great example. She's like, I have eggs. Look, I must be cooking, or she'd stir things. And it's a way that she really played up this America's favorite mother image that she had built first on radio. And then what's funny is these women who, like her, who transferred over from radio, people went wild to see them on the screen because they had heard them for years and years and years. And I mean, some of the early reviews of this show are fascinating just because they were like, we can't believe that we can see her living room and she's in the kitchen and we can see her cooking. So Gertrude was really a force, and I start the book with her because she's really chronologically also at the very beginning of this, really when people were just starting to actually watch television. It starts earlier, but it's one of those crazy things where, like, you know, remember when MP3 players were technically invented, but no one had them yet in the early 2000s, and then suddenly everyone had them. This is when the early adopters are starting, and she really got in at exactly the right time. And the way that I learned about, she was actually one of the first that I learned about of these women as well. You mentioned my book, Marion, Lou, and Rhoda and Ted, which is about the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And that was actually my entree in. That's the 70s. And honestly, if you think about it, the 40s and 50s aren't that far you know, back from there. And when I was looking into kind of the history before that show and women in television in particular because of that show, and very specifically Betty White, who was on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, that was my first clue, was that she, when I was investigating her character on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, if people watched that, she was this character called the Happy Homemaker. She had her own show on the network where Mary's character worked, and she had this wonderful character where she was so sweet, and she had, you know, it was kind of like a Martha Stewart thing. She had a cooking show and a homemaking show. And so on screen on the show, she was like this sweet, they called her sickly sweet persona. And then the minute the cameras turned off, she was very not sweet at all. She was very, very acerbic and cutting and insulted everyone, but always with a beautiful smile on her face. And she, in fact, herself, Betty, used the B word to describe, you know, her character on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And she loved being able to do that because it was so different for her. But the way that character was described in the first script that she was in was a Betty White type, sickly sweet on camera. And I thought, I don't know that. I only know Betty White from the Golden Girls, which, yeah, she's sweet, but it didn't quite jive for me. And so when I looked into it, I found out she had had this incredible career already. By the time she was on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, it was her first comeback in the 70s. She had been on television in the late 40s, starting around 49, into the 50s, and had one of the first daytime talk shows. And when I say daytime, what I actually mean is 5.5 hours a day, 6 days a week. This woman, they didn't know what to do with the daytime hours on television yet, which I think is very funny. They literally didn't know what to do. So one idea in Los Angeles was put Betty White on for 5.5 hours a day. She co-hosted a show with a guy who was a former DJ on the radio. And they had originally started out with this idea that they were actually just gonna play records and sit there. Just like it was a radio show. They didn't know what to do. And so, you know, she'd be on, this guy named Al Jarvis was the guy. And they would have the record play. And while they were playing the record at first, the first couple episodes, she and he would like be chatting, like the audience couldn't hear them. They could hear the record, but they could see them chatting. This is all bizarre, I know. Early television is bizarre. And the audience complained that they couldn't hear, they really wanted to hear what Al and Betty were saying, they didn't want to hear the record. So they got rid of the record, started just doing improv for 5.5 hours a day, 6 days a week, and really started to invent a lot of the tropes that eventually become pretty standard in daytime-ish shows, whether we're talking about something like Ellen or Oprah or more like the Today Show. These were all, you know, they did some, like they do some news commentary. They did skits where they made stuff up. They made up characters. They also had to deliver all of the ads on the air. So it was just kind of this like crazy hodgepodge of things. And this is where the original Betty White persona comes from, is that they loved her because she could stare straight into the camera. It's incredible to watch her do this. She would stare straight into the camera and just smile at you, and she would sing songs straight at you. And people just responded to it. She was known for her high necklines, very demure, very important to be demure at the time. She was a single woman, which is a big deal. So she had to be pretty, you know, protect her virtue as much as possible in her persona. And so she was known for her sort of high necklines, cute dresses, was just, and we're talking, she's in her, you know, mid to late 20s. She's approaching 30 by the end. So very, very young and pretty and personable. So that's Betty White. I learned about Gertrude Berg from the guys who made the Mary Tyler Moore Show, James L. Brooks and Alan Burns, who had mentioned to her as an antecedent to the character of Rhoda, who was Jewish and kind of like brash in New York. And they had a number of inspirations for her, but they mentioned Gertrude, and I had never heard of her. And once I looked into her, it turned out she was incredibly famous at the time, and she had a cookbook and a line of house dresses, and like she was kind of like this Oprah of her day in her own way. So that was when I started to see like, oh, something was going on in these early days, that women were doing a lot and they had a lot of power. Betty also went on to, at the same time as her talk show, she produced and starred in and helped create her own sitcom called Life with Elizabeth. So she and Gertrude were kind of on that track together. And my two other women are a woman named Erna Phillips, who I wanted to talk a little bit about that daytime realm, as in addition to things like Betty White's talk show, the big things. You might be able to guess it's still not that different, or it wasn't that different until recently. The other big thing during the day was soap operas. And Erna is the mother of the soap opera. She created them for radio originally. She was at her heights of radio, and this is in the 30s and 40s, was making $250,000 a year at one point on her empire. She had multiple shows. She created a lot of the tropes that I think we still to this day associate with daytime soap operas. My favorite is the organ cue. It's hard now because I think soap operas are starting to phase out the classics, but if you've ever seen the Californians sketch on Saturday Night Live where they're making fun of soap operas, and there's kind of a dramatic organ cue and they all look and dramatically in silence at each other when someone says something. That is all Erna. She invented the organ cue, and she invented the long dramatic pauses. A lot of the stuff in her notes that I saw would say like, more pauses, please. And the big thing with her is that she really, she was a woman. She was a single mother of two adopted children, never married, and had this empire. She created some of the shows that lasted all the way until very recently, like Guiding Light was on the radio. And the reason we have organ cues is because it was about a pastor helping people with their problems. And so she wanted the organ like in a church. And she said later, like, I don't know why all these other shows adopted this, but now we're stuck with it and I'm sorry. And she didn't even like it in her lifetime. So she created some of these shows that ran for 70 years or more, from radio to television. She really fought for them. And a big thing there was that a lot of male executives were in charge and they just never got it. They never understood that she was making these shows about women for women. And so there were a lot of notes at the time, in her files that were like, completely dismissive of these kinds of plot lines. And why do we have to hear about another desperate woman having stupid problems at home? A lot of that kind of stuff. And some of her earliest shows even just had women. She would do some of the voices. It'd be her and one other woman doing multiple voices. And she really always had to fight for this. She had a better sense of what housewives wanted than most of the men in charge, not surprisingly. And so she fought for things that kind of look silly to us now, but made sense at the time. Like, she was very concerned about whether the women could feel like they could do some of their housework at home while also keeping a little bit of an eye on the screen. So she would, make sure that the plot lines sunk in. And that's part of why she liked a dramatic pause, is to let them kind of like, let it sink in, not move too fast, not throw too much, because she didn't imagine her audience staring at the screen. She imagined them ironing or going to get the wash or that sort of thing. So that's Erna. And my fourth woman is very important, Hazel Scott. This is another one. She's a little bit like Gertrude in the sense that when I looked into her, I call her the Beyonce of her day. She was unbelievably famous and beautiful and multi-talented. Here she is doing her favorite trick, which was where she would play two pianos at once. She was an incredibly accomplished jazz musician, known for something called swinging the classics, which was that she'd take a classical work and start it regular, and then kind of as it went, she'd make it swing. She'd make it cool and hip and new, and really jazzy, and get the audience riled up. And she was she started as a teen star. She was doing this by the time she was 19. She was traveling around the country. She had her own radio show. She was pretty famous already, doing this act. And then when television came in, she was a perfect fit in a lot of ways. You know, she's beautiful. She has a beautiful speaking voice even, and she had this ability to look right in the camera as well. And she'd always just say, "Hi, my name is Hazel Scott," but in this way that's like, all you want to do is watch her more. And so she ended up getting an offer to be the first Black person, not woman, person, to host her own show in prime time nationally. And these are all caveats because there was a lot of confusing stuff going on. There were a lot of regional shows going on. She started regional in New York, but she was able to go national before her time was up. She ran into the blacklist. Her show started in 1950. Later in 1950, her name appeared in this publication called Red Channels, which purported to list suspected communists. And so she ran into this problem, and it's the reason her show kind of like burned really bright. The reviews that I read were so good right until the very end. Like, people were going crazy for her, and like all the reviews were saying, we need more of her. They kept expanding her show. It was on first just in New York, then it was on in New York a couple days a week, then it was on nationally a couple days a week, and they were talking about expanding it even more. And then suddenly she ran into the blacklist, and you know, her show kind of, you know, it's all very murky, but the network she was on, which was called Dumont, there was a fourth network at the time, and they kind of just did some squirrely stuff to get out of it and said like, oops, we can't seem to find a sponsor anymore. And that was it. And it really was after that she ended up moving to Europe, stayed there for a really long time, because she just felt, both in terms of like racial acceptance and, you know, not having to deal with things like being blacklisted. She stayed in Paris for a really long time, eventually came back. But I think that's why a lot of us don't know her name now, is because there's this big hole in her career, and that includes her television legacy, which is almost completely forgotten.
First of all, that was amazing. Thank you. The Red Scare just really ruined it, you know, right or wrong. I mean, they tried to get everybody that had this crazy list to meet Lucille Ball. You know, I mean, they said, oh, well, the only thing red about her is her hair, and even that's not really real. That's not really red. You know, it's just so awful. I have to say that, you know, I went down the rabbit hole with this book as well, and found some video of Hazel Scott singing in English and I think French, "The Man I Love." It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable, and so sad that all went away. But you know, I think you talked about Alicia Keys sort of, you know, mentioning her, and I just think that, you know, it's so important to keep these names alive, because, and thanks to your book they are, because I mean, Betty White is still with us, but I mean, it's you know, I mean, what they did, it's unbelievable. This is another book that reads like a novel, because you not only, like you were saying before, we were talking before about how things aren't linear and there's so much going on. Find out what's going on in all of their lives, you know, when they're not doing this, and it's incredible. You know what each of them did. Like Lainey was talking about Hazel Scott. Lainey, you want to talk about the what's that time when she didn't want to wear the apron in a scene in a movie, right? And you know, just
right, yeah. I was just so surprised at someone being so headstrong with what she accepts and what she takes for that time. I would have thought, you know, a lot of people are fighting for their representation at all, and then she was very outspoken about, I do not want that trope, or I don't want that said about me.
Yeah, she was, that's one of the fascinating things about her. And this was before even her television career. It's one of the reasons that she liked the idea of being on television in the context she was given is because it was not a talk show, but a variety show. She would just basically play music.
Right.
And that gave her ultimate control over how she was going to be portrayed. She's literally playing herself, and all she's doing is playing the piano, and she gets to choose her wardrobe. So that she loved that. She said I talked to her son for this, and she said it was her ideal job because it was near home. It was in New York. And so she could be near her son, who was a small child at the time. And she could be her and totally control it. And, you know, before that, you mentioned she was doing movies before that for a while. And there was this thing in the 40s where there would be these movies where it was just like one or two musical performances from big acts, and they would kind of make up a plot, like, we're putting on a Broadway show and we have to audition all these famous, you know, musical acts, and so they just kind of come through. And that's what she was doing in this movie called The Heat's On, a Mae West movie. And she had a bunch of stipulations in her contract about what she would wear. She would never wear a uniform except a military uniform. And the idea of that is no maid uniforms. That's what she was getting at. Right. And she said she didn't want any singing maid parts, which was very common at the time. And so she could only be billed as herself. She could only be Hazel Scott as Hazel Scott. That again narrows what she could play, right? Can only play a musician at that point. So this is the kind of thing she had in her contract. But then what she ran into on The Heat's On is that she went to do her scene, and all the dancers in the scene, the female Black dancers, were dressed in dirty aprons. And they were supposed to be seeing their men off to war in the scene. And she was livid because she said no Black woman would see her man off to war in a dirty apron. And she refused to come to work for a couple of days until their costumes were changed and they were able to eventually wear, I believe it was their own dresses, and they're seen in mostly like floral dresses. So she was very clear, and she also would not play segregated venues. She walked out of a few big gigs in the moment, like walked in, saw it, said nope, and they said it's going to cost you $2,000, and she said I don't care. And she really dealt with a lot of stuff. She used her platform to perpetuate her activism. There was a lot of debate within the Black community that I read about at the time about how to do this, you know, about whether this was necessary and how to do this, but she felt really strongly. She was married to Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was the first Black representative in Congress from New York City, from Harlem. And he was a big activist too. And they really, especially once they met and married, they really joined forces and often would kind of purposely, you know, do this sort of thing. And I think, you know, the TV show, if it had lasted longer, could have been another real way to do that. And I think she saw it that way. And especially as TV itself grew, she could have been right there in living rooms across the country. She was already, but it wasn't as big as it was about to be. You know, this was still 1950. By 1955 is when people really start to, like, everyone has television and it's the norm.
Right. And yeah, it's that is such the shame, you know, but I think you say in the book that she guest starred on Julia, Diane Carroll's show, and it was the first African American woman who had a sitcom. Is that right?
That is correct. Which, I mean, again, you know, I don't know every single thing that went on in Hazel's head, but I know enough about her history to say that she knew exactly what she was doing when she was on Julia, because that was, to me, there were problems with Julia too that that you can pick apart, but for its time in the 70s, this was about a single mother who was a nurse, and she's Black, and it was the first Black female sitcom. And I think that this is exactly the legacy she wanted, right? This is the opposite of a singing maid role. This is a main role, very dignified, professional woman, portrayed beautifully by this wonderful actress. And I think that she would, I'm sure that she saw that as a great outgrowth of her own legacy.
Yeah. So cool. And for everybody out there, as I say, I went down the rabbit hole last night and could just watch all these clips of her. Oh, so beautiful, and
She
that
is.
voice. And you're right, she has a distinct. There's a way about her that she's from Trinidad, right?
Mhm. Yeah, she was an immigrant. It's a really good point. She immigrated with her mother and her grandmother at a young age, right directly to Harlem. And in fact, some people had talked about the fact that maybe part of her kind of like her way of that we've been talking about of like really standing up for herself and Black people may have come from that, like the confidence may have come from coming from a country where she was not a minority and coming directly to Harlem, where she was also surrounded by Black people doing incredible things at that time. And so she just seemed to feel like, of course of course I am entitled to be treated this way, and it's crazy. And I think she had a lot of confidence, partly because of that, and also just because she was a brilliant
Like a
talent.
child prodigy, really, right?
Yeah, she was actually named a child prodigy by Juilliard. So
that's right. And she was in her mother had an all-female band. And she was like in this band when she was like 15 years old.
Yes, it's one of those things that happens in a book like this where you're like, I want to know everything about that too. I wish I could have just like gone in that direction too. But yeah, she's starting as a teenager. She was playing in her mother was a brilliant musician too, and really pushed her. Well, I think a little bit of a stage mom, but not maybe in the terrible way we think of. Just because like she wanted Hazel to have those, to be able to accomplish those things that she couldn't.
Well, we could go on forever about both of these books. I will say, as a Guiding Light fan, my grandmother and my mother used to listen to it on the radio. And then I started to watch it, when I was, I guess, a teenager on television, and was devastated when it ended. But to think that this woman, Erna, lit the match. It's amazing. It's really
it really is, like, for that long and in circumstance and everything else. And they all just fought so many battles along the way. I mean, it's why it was fun to write about in a book, is because they really faced so many things. People just kept trying to stop them, and they really did the best they could.
And God love them, because it's and their best was great. I think really. And then, as I say, the whole backstory, Erna and those kids that she adopted. I mean, who does that at that time? And then she does that, and then she's questioning all of that. Like, there's just so much in this book. Yeah.
I was shocked when I learned that. I really was. I was like looking up, like, what were the laws? Is this okay? Like, all of this stuff. But yeah, she was a single mother of 2 adopted children. And it was scandalous at the time. I found some letters and things where men were saying things like, she had these two children under mysterious circumstances, which really is, to me, they're trying to imply something that wasn't true. Really did adopt them, from everything I could see in her archive. And they're really trying to say, like, maybe she got knocked up and, didn't marry the guy or whatever. Like, they're really trying, like, constantly casting kind of aspersions on her. And she struggled, as I talk about in the book, she struggled a lot with the, raising them versus having this incredible career, and didn't always feel like she did a good job. But it's an incredible effort. And I feel like, now that would make total sense and everyone would think that was great. But at the time it was really, frowned upon and made people think a lot of things about her.
Chris, Lainey, we have a couple of questions in the chat box.
My favorite is just a statement from Vicky Nesting. Why don't we know about these women?
You do now.
Exactly. It's so shocking. It honestly is really shocking. In fact, my agent at some point said to me something years ago, like, well, people really want more stories about, like, untold stories about women. And I made a joke like, oh, let me look in my untold stories about women box. But then I did, and they were there. Like, it really is actually incredible. They were deliberately written out, as far as I'm concerned, from these histories. I read some books that are supposed to be definitive histories of this time. And for someone, especially like Gertrude Berg, not to be in them, I mean, the rest, it's like, who knows, maybe you were focusing on prime time or whatever, but Gertrude Berg has to be in there if Milton Berle's in there, and and they were just not in the, I looked in the index and they weren't there. And I just thought like, my God, that's insane.
As you say, lost to the footnotes.
Yeah.
Right. And we didn't have time to even talk because there's so much to talk about, but they even, started the way you advertise on TV too,
Oh,
which is
yeah.
Yeah, that's a huge
insane.
part of what they do. And what I would just say briefly about that is all these women had really good business brains. And that's a huge part of it, is figuring out how to make the money that needs to be made. That's TV. That's always been TV and probably always will be to some extent. And they were smart enough to figure out different ways that we still kind of use now to sell these products.
I love the Molly Goldberg and the Sanka can with the geranium in it. And
Yeah.
just the placement
Yep.
there's that footage too of, I forget what the product is called. I couldn't figure out what it was for, but she's talking about it as, I think, as her character, and she's talking. I mean, they're doing their own commercials.
Yeah, she was really her famous kind of contribution was to deliver the commercials not just on the air, in general as part of the show, but she actually stayed in character the entire time.
Yeah.
And it's super compelling to watch. It actually became my favorite thing about watching the Goldbergs, was how she was going to sell Sanka this week. Because my God, I mean, you watch it and you think like, my God, I got to get some Sanka.
Exactly.
Like, so 95% of the caffeine is removed, all the sleep is left in, and she wrote them all in the Gertrude Berg voice. And that's the part, I mean, she does, and they go on forever and you don't care. And she's like talking about their vacation, and you're like, how's she going to get to Sanka? And then she's like, a lot of people at that place they're having trouble sleeping. And I'm like, here it comes. I'm going to talk about Sanka because it's decaffeinated. That was why it was a really big deal that they had instant decaffeinated coffee you could drink at night before you go to bed.
That's your second t-shirt. God, I got to get some Sanka.
Yes, we're thinking that we need t-shirts made of both of your books because they're so cool. Your book and
there's a lot of love here, and I don't know if you have some time, you maybe could go back and respond, but one question is, how did your fascination with television begin?
I talk about it even briefly in the beginning of the book, but yeah, we were a TV family. I grew up in the 80s, and the story I always like to tell is like, I don't know, I just was into it from the beginning. My family watched a lot of TV together. We watched the Mary Tyler Moore Show together, and others like Rhoda and the Bob Newhart Show. I have strong memories of everyone, of us all watching it together. And I just got really into it. And like, I remember getting TV guides in the mail. And you'd get it's like this big, and you'd get this little magazine, and it's like the magazine wrapped around your schedule. And I would go through and circle all the things I was going to watch that week. And then I'd read all the stories. So I was on that track from the beginning. I love all of pop culture, and that's what I've made my career writing about. And I think it's very interesting how much it affects our actual lives. That was what I was fascinated by, is like, oh, this makes me feel something. I want to be like Mary and Rhoda. I'm only 5 and I want to be like Mary and Rhoda. That's a huge deal. That has an effect on your life. But I got really nerdy about this stuff. I would go to the library and read, and really, my mom would drop me off. And if I decided I was into the Mary Tyler Moore Show that week, I would go and go periodical guide to literature, look up the Mary Tyler Moore Show, read everything they had about it, go to the card catalog, read everything they had about it there. Why isn't there more? Could I write something about it? Like, that was sort of how I always was with all of my pop culture. And, TV ended up being, once I worked at Entertainment Weekly as part of my career for about 10 years. And that was where I ended up going. And I think it's interesting how history lives through TV. Like, it really has to reflect its time more than other media. And it, especially at the time of like classic prime network television, when they're making it pretty close to the time that it airs, they're making it a few weeks before, they're really reacting in the moment. And I think there's so much interesting history in that, and also in the ways that they have to respond to business pressures and all that. There's like a lot of factors that I think makes TV really interesting.
That's so true. There really is so much, there's so much in this book aside from these women, and then there are those offshoots about some other people in the roles that they have played. And then and the World's Fair, where the TV just sort of, debuted, and people were like, what
Mhm.
is that? And it's how much money people made, or how much a TV cost at that time, and how that would relate to now, and with the, relatively speaking, there's just not enough time to talk about it all. But all
That's
I
why you
can,
got to read it.
that's why I got to read it. We bring on the books that we love, and I don't know. I mean, there are so many questions here, and Jennifer, because we're kind of running out of time, I think if you are you okay to answer these questions on Facebook
Absolutely.
on your own? So anyone here who's not gotten a question answered, which is a good amount, Jennifer can go back in and answer them all. So they'll all be on Facebook and you can all see them, right? That'll work?
Yes.
Okay. I, as much as I hate to bring us to a close, I have to. But let's bring Kim back in and have some final thoughts on really amazing women, written by really amazing women. I'm going to take these glasses off because they're just too glaring. Hello. Hi. Kim, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Have you been able to watch?
Let me close. I have.
Cool.
So fascinating.
Yeah, they're both, there's this connective tissue between your books, and they're both so important. And we three of us have talked about how they both read like novels. I read a quote for Kim's book, and for Jennifer's book list gave it a starred review and says, with crisp, electrifying prose, Armstrong recounts the hard work and struggle of four women trailblazers who shaped the dawn of television. It is that, and so much more. But at the heart of this, I think, in the quote for your book, Kim, is legacy. I mean, that's what this is, and you've done this with these books. You because what these women have done is so important, and so brave, and smart. Uh, I can't speak enough about these books and how important they are and how fun they are to read. They're fascinating studies of these women. Um, and I was saying before, March is Women's History Month, and I don't know. I just feel like this is leading into it, although it shouldn't. It should be every month should be Women's History Month. So there, but Chris, you know that. I don't know. Are there any closing thoughts that you all have, or that you want to just share with us?
If I could just jump in, it just strikes me, Jennifer, listening to you talk, like how often right at the start of industry or fields of inquiry, like it's wide open and there's a ton of women there. And then as soon as people start figuring out how to monetize it, they start putting up roadblocks, right? Oh, you can't be like practice medicine unless you've gone to med school or to journalism school, or you can't be a biologist unless you have a biology degree. And all those schools are closed to women, for example. And it just seems exactly to be what your book shows so well.
Yeah, it's really true. I mean, it's just I was thinking about that with yours as well, or just seeing them do, like, she rides a steam engine. It's just they're and it's interesting how they find those ways. Like you said, they never say, even at that time, really, you can't do this because you're a woman. They kind of even knew then they weren't supposed to do that, but instead they just blacklist them, or like come up, oh, oops, we can't find an advertiser, or oops, the schedule seems to be full, was a big thing in TV, and yeah, they just sort of find these ways to move women and people of color out of the way when the white men would like to come in and take over. And yeah, it's sort of a never-ending thing, but it's inspiring to know that all of these women did these things at these times when we think of them not being able to do them. And we just have to keep moving forward.
Beautifully said. Well, these women won't be lost to the footnotes, as you say, because of these two amazing books that you've written, that you you place into our hands, and we're placing into the hands of librarians who are watching. And I know there are many who have questions for both of you. So I know at some point if you can go back and answer those questions. And Chris, Lainey, do you have any thoughts? Anything that, or anybody want to say anything before we sign off?
Just how amazing this has been. I could talk all day. There's so much, and people who will stay with me who I didn't know, and I'm excited to say, well, did you know that actually like that? Well, that's my favorite thing, to learn something new, and you guys make it fun to learn something new. So thank you.
I do think just something that came through in both books is progress is not a straight angled line upwards, and that's take constant effort and diligence and awareness. And I think that's something these books do for us now, present times as well. So it's the benefits are twofold, both shining light on the past and showing a way forward. So thank you so much. It's been completely eye-opening and fantastic. So thank you. Yay.
Thank you.
Thank you both. So just again, if anybody wants to speak with us about bringing Kim or Jennifer virtually for now to your libraries, just send us an email. We will be happy to make that happen. So When Women Invented Television by Jennifer Armstrong is on sale March 23rd. And Sensational by Kim Todd is on sale March 13th. And we thank you all for watching. We're glad that you are as into this as we are. It's just, it's been a great hour and change, and really special. So thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye, everyone. See you next time.